Hey all, your OS reviews. In this video, we're taking a revisited throwback look at the LG G7 here in 2025. This Android smartphone came out in 2018, so believe it or not, it's already 7 years old. Time really does fly. And yet, in many ways, this shiny and beautiful looking device, I think, was quite forward thinking and has held up very well. Of course, LG is no longer making smartphones. They have since quit this space, and their presence continues to be missed by many LG fans and enthusiasts around the world just because it offered something a little bit different, and having more options to pick between is always good for us as consumers. So it's just rather sad and goes to show how difficult it is to survive in the world of consumer tech and smartphones in general. But anyways, one of the reasons why I wanted to take another look at the G7 was because recently we saw a couple of Android-powered DAPs or digital audio players like the Michen H10, which sells for around $65 and has a 4-inch display, technically still running on a version of Android. And that got me thinking, maybe you can also use a slightly older generation Android smartphone as a DAP or digital audio player alternative. And that's actually where I think some of LG's previous flagships do have a nice advantage on, because it has a Quad Dac and also a 3.5mm headphone jack here on the bottom, versus Bluetooth, for example, which is more convenient because it's wireless, but Bluetooth is inherently a more lossy signal because there is some amount of compression which is happening for the audio to be sent wirelessly, which is why, again, audiophiles still prefer using wired headphones to this day. But coming back to my original premise, again, the LG G7 you can actually now find on third-party sites like eBay, for example, for around $30 when shopping around, which is just incredible, putting it firmly into the ultra budget territory, as you can tell here. And that is for a device which is much more powerful and premium feeling than the newer budget DAPs on the market. When it comes to the build quality, this thing is all plastic versus having all metal as well as glass on the G7, not to mention a more capable processor as well that makes the entire experience just feel more fluid and smooth. So certainly on paper, this seems like a really strong option that many people may have forgotten about, similar to higher end MP3 players or DAPs from Sony Walkman, Fio, for example, Shanling, might also serve your needs quite well. Granted, perhaps one advantage of these dedicated players would be a slightly more compact frame because the G7 still has a 6.1-inch screen. Now, by 2025 standards though, screen sizes have continued to grow, and now 6.5 inches is kind of the norm. So next to a device like this, it still isn't bad when it comes to general portability, and of course a larger screen also means you are able to use it for watching back videos if you choose to do so more comfortably. But if you want something which is tiny and miniature size, then that's where some of the dedicated players may still be even more compact. Now, if we briefly revisit some of the top line specs, the G7 came with a Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 Octa-Core processor, the same chip found on the Samsung Galaxy S9, and it's actually a very capable processor that has held up extremely well, where things like basic navigation still feels very fluid and fast, despite the fact that it's a standard 60Hz refresh rate on the screen, which by the way is also a 2K resolution IPS LCD screen, which is very colorful and actually one of the first panels on the market to reach a impressively bright 1000 nits. So under the boosted mode, even if you're looking at this thing under direct sunlight, it can still be kind of visible, supporting HDR10 and also having that Quad HD resolution, protected by Corning Gorilla Glass here on the front as well as on the back, which by the way also supports Qi wireless charging too. So if you pop it onto a compatible kind of Qi or MagSafe style charging pad, you're able to quickly top it up, as you can tell there, without plugging in any cables for added convenience. And as a previous flagship phone, it also comes with IP68 dust and water resistance, up to 1.5 meters of water for 30 minutes. In fact, even comes with a military 810G certification. Even taking some photos underwater, this device will still survive, which is quite impressive. The phone also comes with built-in stereo speakers, one here at the bottom and also the earpiece here on the top also acts as the second piece. The G7 also came with a built-in resonance chamber, which they dubbed the boombox speaker. If you set it down onto a hollow surface, it actually is able to amplify the volume coming out from it, giving you a little bit more added bass. It's an interesting technology, transforming objects like boxes into an echo chamber for the speaker, which we'll see later on in this video as well. Also, LG was one of the first brands to really play around with having a a dual camera system, and they really made the ultra wide angle lens as we know it popular in modern smartphones, something that we just really take for granted. But you see that here, there are dual 16 megapixel lenses on the rear, one which is the primary getting down to an f1.9, pretty fast and bright, and also the secondary ultra wide angle for capturing more without having to step as far back. It's assisted with laser autofocus as well as the fingerprint scanner, and again a very shiny and polished appearance, kind of reminding me of jewelry. In fact, this was back in the days where we saw more gradient color effects on manufacturers, and the G7 came in vibrant options, including a red rose version, which is quite eye-popping, in addition to the silver that we have here, and also a blue version could all be picked between. Furthermore, something that I appreciate is the back of this phone is almost completely flush, meaning you can easily slide it into a pocket or pop it onto a table without really anything wobbling. So there really isn't a camera hump on that optically image stabilized 16 megapixel camera system. Located on the right-hand spine of the phone, there's just a power key, bottom here also featuring again a Type-C port for charging as well as for data transfer. In fact, the G7 does also support video output, and there is kind of a light version of a desktop mode if you connect it to an external monitor. It's not quite as robust as something like Samsung DeX, but it's better than nothing. And then on the other side, we have access to volume rocker as well as a assistant key. Now, this was also an aspect which was kind of controversial for its time. Back in 2018, 2019, it was when some of these AI assistants were getting pushed heavily for the first time, which is why the G7 got the rather strange name ThinQ, alluding to the fact that the phone can think with some more intelligent or smart features. Of course, 7 years ago, large language models really weren't a thing commercially yet, so back then it was actually criticized because folks would accidentally hit this button and pull up Google Assistant. But all of these years later, again, large language models, Gemini, has definitely improved in terms of being able to synthesize content, teach you information, generate summaries more effectively than ever. Maybe it finally makes sense to have a button like this on the side of a device like this. Especially now we see some AI-specific gadgets like the Rabbit R1 popping up. And then last but not least, on the very top of the device, you'll also find the SIM card / microSD card slot. So the phone came with either 64 or 128 gigabytes of built-in storage, which is thankfully further expandable via a microSD card, which is going to be good if you are planning on using it as a music player and holding more songs and local media files on it. Finally, on the very top here of the screen, you'll see a small notch that consists of a proximity sensor, small earpiece, as well as a 8 megapixel selfie lens. Note though, unlike an iPhone, it doesn't actually have 3D face unlock. It still is just a single selfie lens, although it does have that fingerprint scanner on the rear, which is thankfully quite fast and accurate. Plus, if you find the notch to be distracting, you can always hide it from view, simply giving you some status information like time as well as essentials here at a glance, and now making the device a bit more symmetrical in terms of the top as well as the bottom chin. And the phone also came equipped with either 4 or 6 gigabytes of RAM, depending on the version that you picked up, which means if you are multitasking by 2025 standards, if you get the 4 gig base version, sometimes apps will take a moment to reload if you're opening up too many. However, the CPU and GPU are still relatively smooth and responsive, even now all these years later. That being said, the one spec I would say that has maybe not held up quite as well would be the battery life, and that is because back in the day it came with just a 3000 milliamp hour capacity battery inside. That was a compromise to hit a more lightweight as well as slim design, super light in fact for a flagship that's built out of metal and glass. So on the positive side, it really doesn't weigh you down when you're traveling with it. However, if you're picking up a used model after all these years, there will inevitably be some degree of battery degradation. And so when coupled with a Quad HD screen, just keep in mind it's no longer going to be really an endurance champion, making it firmly just a one-day phone. In fact, you may have to top up at some points if you're using it more heavily. That is definitely one con compared to devices that have a larger battery capacity underneath the hood. That being said, if you're only using this as a offline local music player, again with all the tracks stored on the system's memory and just plugging in headphones, for that purpose, it definitely still work without any problems, especially if you are using it in the airplane mode with Wi-Fi and cellular turned off, then it will still comfortably last in that mode for hours and hours before it really runs dry. So it really depends on expectations and what you're using this thing for. Again, for gaming, more intensive tasks, the battery life will definitely be shorter, but for just simple music playback locally and offline, it will still be, I think, fine for the most part. Otherwise, the device comes fully stocked with Bluetooth 5 connectivity, as well as support for aptX HD. In addition to FM radio support is on here as well if you plug in headphones to act as the antenna. Pretty nice to see. And specifically, the Quad DAC here is the ES9218P that supports up to 32-bit 192 kilohertz audio tracks, which is actually still quite impressive all of these years later. And then phones after the G7, like the G8, G8X, continued with the Quad DAC built on in, which was nice to see. And that being said, in my opinion, the G8X that we also reviewed a while back just feels a little bit more like a heavier, bigger device. Sporting a 6.4-inch screen instead of the 6.1-inch panel of the G7, it was noticeably thicker as well because it was packing a 4,000 versus 3,000 milliamp hour capacity battery. So a little bit more chunky, and of course it upgrades to a faster Snapdragon 855 processor. But for some reason, I'm going to be honest, the G8X has never been my most favorite LG device ever. I mean, yes, it has its charm and certainly has a longer endurance as well as some optional accessories like a dual screen case, which is pretty cool. Continues to retain that flush camera placement, which is also neat to see as well. But in my opinion, the design of the G7 for some reason just seems a bit more stylish. Maybe it's the camera bar that's also vertical instead of horizontal, which I think is a little bit more symmetrical and interesting looking, or perhaps it's the fact that it's just a more lightweight phone. For some reason, I just feel like this is a bit more polished and refined feeling versus the G8X when I pick it up, which in a way LG returned to on some of their last devices like the LG Velvet that we revisited a while back as well, one of their last ever smartphones, returning to a very stylish as well as nice design touches like the flush camera array that has kind of this raindrop finish getting progressively smaller, showing lots of attention to detail. However, the Velvet has more of a mid-range processor for its time. The screen size continued to balloon, now getting more into a phablet territory. It's harder to use with only one hand if you have smaller hands, that is. And although it retains a 3.5mm headphone jack, which is nice, it no longer has the Quad DAC inside. And so in terms of the resolution of audio tracks, as well as types of headphones it's able to drive, isn't quite as impressive. Not to mention some of those newer gen devices also tend to sell for a little bit higher on the third-party marketplace as well. So that's why I think, again, the G7 actually might be an interesting value proposition if you're primarily thinking of using it as a MP3 player or a DAP alternative. Out of the G series of phones that we've seen from LG previously, actually might be one of my favorites looking back. As for the software situation, again, if you're using it only as a offline music player, it doesn't really matter that it's no longer on the latest version of the OS, although of course you can always find ways to root it and then maybe flash a newer version of a ROM if you wanted to go that way. But officially it came on Android Oreo and was updated to Android 10, receiving 2 OS level updates. The phone as a flagship device also came with excellent haptics, so vibration motor as you're typing and swiping around the entire device felt super precise and tight. And then LG's launcher on top of Android, even though it's far from being stock, actually isn't that bad, all things considered. There's double tap to wake and lock, and then on the left of the home screen, you have access to basically their version of the Google News feed. They call it a smart bulletin. You're able to find any calendar events which are coming up, as well as instantly play back any music tracks, and you can reshuffle some of the widgets that you want to have displayed. Again, general system navigation getting around the UI still feels quite fluid all of these years later, and of course you have access to all the full Google apps, including the Play Store as aforementioned. LG also includes their version of utility tools like the calendar, gallery as well, which has been slightly customized to fit the overall launcher and aesthetic of the device. Furthermore, LG bundles in an HD quality voice recorder that they created, taking advantage of the, again, excellent audio capabilities of the phone, allowing you to also record in FLAC 24-bit, believe it or not, and even change some of the audio gain settings as well. So very granular. Now, depending on the version of the phone you pick up, whether it's unlocked or if it was a carrier variant from Sprint, T-Mobile, or Verizon here in the United States, you'll also find a handful of carrier bloatware on the device, but it's not bad. Just a couple, as you can see here from Verizon, that you can mostly just ignore or disable if you're not using them. And now checking out the music player app, it's a very clean layout, and you can also see if there's any hi-fi tracks being labeled up top. Again, recognizing FLAC, lossless resolution tracks without any issues. And you're also able to activate some more kind of playful features like a flashlight mode. So what this is doing is it's using the LED flash on the back of the phone as an equalizer with the beat of the music or sound, as you can tell there, kind of flashing along there, maybe in the dark, kind of dancing along in a way that almost reminds me of some Sony Xperia devices like the PSP and Walkman players from back in the day. You can even tap again to change the visualization style. Here's one which is going to be round instead, just adding a touch of fun, I guess. Allows us to normalize the volume level if you're playing multiple tracks across different albums and the sound is recorded at a different level. You can make them even, as well as find different preset equalizers, including classic, pop, rock, hip hop, jazz, vocal boost, treble boost, bass boost, as well as a custom one where you can adjust the dials here yourself based on your preferences. Furthermore, with headphones plugged in, we can activate the Quad Dac mode, and also from here, also select some more advanced settings, including the digital filter, either a short, sharp, or slow for a more natural sound versus clear sound, ambient sound, in addition to some profiles for the Quad Dac, including enhanced mode, detailed, live versus bass mode, and this is on top of the equalizer if you want to further amplify the effect. Further scrolling down here allows us to change the balance. If a track might be a little bit skewed when recorded in stereo towards the left or the right, you can make the left and right channel louder or more quiet. Last but not least, there's also a DTS-X 3D surround sound profile, but this is more like an equalizer as opposed to using head tracking. Kind of like Dolby Atmos, might be a little bit more suited if you're watching movies and videos. You can also pull here to find a wide soundstage mode versus simulating sound coming from the front versus coming from the side, creating some slight differences in the sound imaging using the simulated software. When you're also playing on select songs, if there's cover art information available, you can see that fill up here on the top of the screen. And also further down below here, we can even change the pitch as well as speed of the playback. Maybe if you're listening to an audiobook or just want to increase the speed, you can try playing around with this, making it faster versus slower. And another detail I like is there's a tab on the top that we can click on to find the music video if available. It will search for this track on YouTube, and so if available, you'll be able to watch back the music video as well. Furthermore, you can rearrange tracks. For example, if you have various songs from different artists to create your own playlist. The sound output is extremely clean through the 3.5mm headphone jack, and also provides plenty of volume output as well, even for larger headphones. So it does provide you with a nuanced, detailed, and satisfying listening experience. We can also jump into something like the camera interface next, just by double tapping on the camera key here. And we can see the layout is relatively simple and straightforward. We can tap on the icon here of the forest and the tree to swipe back and forth between the ultra wide angle lens versus the primary lens. You can also swipe between a portrait mode using the second camera to collect depth information, as well as Google Lens for scanning in objects, versus AI camera, which will try to recognize different objects and apply a different scene filter on it automatically. For example, a flower here, it should be able to identify that. Compared to maybe some food that's identified, it will change some of the color signs of the camera accordingly, as well as a cheese shutter mode that will recognize key phrases like cheese, smile, whiskey, kimchi, or LG, and when it detects that using the microphone, it will take an image automatically, maybe for selfies or group shots when the phone is a little bit further away. Likewise, for the front-facing camera, you can also change the intensity of a beauty mode, turn this on or off, and you can also pretty easily adjust through a couple of other presets in terms of color signs that you can switch between, from more vibrant to being a bit more muted. And you can also change into some additional settings over here, including a full manual mode. This is also pretty neat to see and shows how similar to Sony, LG is all about making these more enthusiast decisions. Whether it's the more exhaustive audio capability or in the camera, allowing you to fine control options like the ISO, white balance, even the focus point can be adjusted manually here as well, as you can tell, using the clicks here, which are simulated in a pretty convincing way because of the excellent haptic vibration motor. So plenty of control for folks looking for that, and furthermore, you can also bring up some even more scene effects that are borrowed from Graphy. For example, a night view mode, sky mode versus a maybe snapshot mode, and then apply on your images instead of editing it in post. And this is of course on top of the built-in scene effects that you have from LG, including black and white, film simulation modes, so on and so forth. And then similarly, there's also a full manual video recording mode as well. So it actually mirrors the interface that we saw for photos, but on here, we can see the left and right sides of the microphone on the top and bottom. Once again, we're able to change the focus peaking manually here as well. And there's also something called Cinevideo. So it's explained by LG as using lookup tables to alter colors in a video using a formula crafted with the help of film professionals to record high-quality videos resembling motion pictures. So it's kind of boosting the contrast, almost like an auto HDR effect, to make the videos look a little bit more cinematic. There's even a zoom point that can smoothly zoom in and out without any jitter, even though this is done digitally because there is no telephoto zoom lens on this particular setup, granting you plenty of controls to play around with. Again, zooming in here in a pretty smooth way, up to 3 times digitally using this particular camera system. And then here's all of the other scene effects that you can also apply, including documentary, romantic, drama, historical, melodrama, classic, thriller, flashback. All of these special effects, which are pretty fun to play with, I have to admit, built into the camera system. So they really went all out with tons of software tricks that you can play with on top of the auto mode. So even though the camera hardware, of course, by 2025 standards, it's nothing spectacular, simply because the sensor size of the cameras are still on the relatively small side, coupled with the auto mode not being quite as consistent as a Google Pixel or an iPhone or Galaxy device, but still you can definitely get some fairly impressive looking results, including excellent macros. As you can tell here of some of the cherry blossoms, everything here in the background is kind of falling off. Colors are nice and punchy looking, and still is, I think, a pretty solid camera just for some simple snaps, thanks to the scene recognition capabilities of the camera. In fact, here's a quick example of the auto scene recognition being off versus on. You can see it just becomes a bit more vibrant when it's identified a plant if you want that added pop, versus being a bit more muted and perhaps realistic. Some more built-in scene effects. This one has a bit more of an aged look to it as well, also looking quite nice, versus a cooler color tone, all done as we are capturing the image, can be directly selected. So really not bad. This was a darker environment, and you can still see plenty of detail zooming in at 16 megapixels. So yeah, actually surprisingly not bad for what it is. The front-facing 8 megapixel camera may not be the sharpest in the world, but definitely for just some quick selfies as well as maybe video calls, it still does the job without too many problems. Long holding on the home screen for a couple of seconds, we're also able to find a handful of custom wallpapers that LG built in here as well, which shows off again the vibrancy of this IPS LCD screen. Very colorful with rich and vibrant viewing angles, with some additional settings here for other theme packs. You want to turn it into a more transparent white look, as well as always on display mode. If you don't like the more minimalist style clock, you can have a simple cute emoji cartoon figure being displayed here as well, like a cat or astronaut figure. And then LG's launcher also gives you full access to transition effects if you wanted to have a kind of flipping effect, panoramic effect, carousel effect, versus just a simple slide effect going between different pages. In addition to icon packs, you can make them slightly more rounded, so on and so forth, based on your preferences. Even the Smart Assistant page on the left of the home screen can also be turned on and off, although you can't bring the Google Newsfeed back by default. And honestly, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all of the advanced settings that you can further play around with. It's really quite exhaustive in terms of what you can access and trigger, including even the screen res. If you find that the Quad HD is maybe draining too much power, you can actually scale the resolution down to something like Full HD or as low as just 720p instead. Gesture navigation on the bottom of the screen can also be changed back into on-screen virtual keys if you prefer, and even the button arrangement in terms of their order, flipping them to the left and right of the screen. Similarly, under screen color, we can go into options like a cinema mode versus a sports mode, gaming mode, or a custom mode, allowing you to change the saturation, hue, sharpness, all based on your own preferences using the slider here, including the color temperature here to becoming warmer versus cooler, and even the fine RGB level red, greens, and blues can be adjusted on the panel here as well. And a couple of other accessibility functions here include a virtual bar on the side of the screen that you can pull up, granting you access to a quick view into a memo pad that you can doodle and draw using your finger here. Now, it doesn't support a active stylus pen, unlike a Samsung Galaxy S Pen, for example, but you can definitely add some quick memos and notes and then save it here as well into the phone storage instead of this floating bar on the edge of the screen, even though it is a flat display which isn't curved on this particular device. By the way, this little bomb icon here also correlates to the boosted 1000 nits that the screen here can reach at the maximum brightness level that you can turn on and off. They're quite playful. Now, in terms of the basics when it comes to cellular antenna reception, is also quite good on the G7, even in 2025. If you're trying to use it as a basic phone or a backup phone, you can still, of course, use it with 4G LTE bands in the US as well as internationally. So, for example, with T-Mobile, it certainly is still going to function without any problems for making making calls. Reception in the Seattle region was also not too problematic. Similar to the dual band Wi-Fi, I was consistently getting around 3 to 4 bars, so staying connected wasn't too problematic. Now by default, LG is using their custom keyboard, but it also supports swipe, and you can opt for something like Google's Gboard instead by installing that from the Play Store if you prefer. Now again, the Snapdragon 845 I think has held up quite well, so if we jump into the full desktop site of something like The Verge, you can see that despite being a relatively complex site with lots of ads and video elements, it's still loading back in a relatively quick way, which is to say, even though it's not the fastest processor anymore, when it comes to simple web browsing, it still keeps up surprisingly quite nicely. It was a pretty good era for Qualcomm, including the later 855, also did quite well, and the 865, but unfortunately the 888, 8 Gen 1, both had some more thermal throttling issues that thankfully you don't really get in some of these older chips. So again, even though they're not going to be lightning fast anymore, it still feels actually quite solid, comparable in fact to some mid-range phones, and faster still than some entry-level budget phones, even after all of these years when it comes to performance. Again, the super sharp screen means that even if you're looking at tiny text details, everything still looks crystal sharp. And then yes, the phone also supports split-screen multitasking windows as well, so if you want to swipe through 2 programs here side by side, it also seems to work without too many problems for the most part. Let's also take a quick look at video playback, just doing a quick YouTube demo here next. So hopefully, as you guys can hear in that demo, as we set it down onto a table or surface, the audio for some reason seems to get fuller and even richer sounding as part of the boombox acoustics on the rear. When you were first picking it up, it actually sounded a little bit more thin, but again, on a larger surface, the audio does seem to improve using that unique speaker system. Really not bad in terms of volume, and the stereo speakers are functional, though I will say on that particular aspect, the bottom speaker is definitely a little louder than the earpiece, which is a bit more quiet, more like a tweeter, so not completely balanced there, but still better than nothing, I would say, and a still very enjoyable experience just for content consumption. As for basic apps and games that you can download from the Google Play Store, simple tap-and-go casual games like Stack, as you can tell here, can still play back in a pretty smooth way, so if you're doing some casual gaming, shouldn't be that problematic. And similarly, for some basic social media, whether it's WhatsApp, Twitter, or X, it will definitely still work for that as well. But that's definitely an area where an even faster GPU, as well as a faster refresh rate for the screen, will be more beneficial. But again, for some casual usage when it comes to light gaming, as well as just for, again, scrolling through some quick documents, social media, I would say the phone still keeps up without too many problems. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited look back or kind of retro review of the LG G7 here in 2025. Again, I do think it's quite sad that we no longer see LG as an active player in the smartphone space, because they really came out with quite unique devices that kind of catered to a more enthusiast crowd. They were always daring enough to try something a little bit different, resulting in even less competition for some of the giants remaining in this space, like Samsung, for example. I mean, yes, LG's phones were perhaps never quite as fully polished as the Samsung Galaxies of the world, but some of its rough corners and quirkiness is also what made them so endearing. But anyways, I would say the G7, again, if you are considering it as a hi-fi MP3 player or a digital audio player, I would say it still is surprisingly a pretty decent option, as long as you're okay with the 6-inch screen size that this device touts, but definitely unrivaled value when it comes to the hardware that you're picking up. A very polished and beautiful looking fit and finish, as well as surprisingly pretty solid performance still using that 845 chip, providing a pretty easy to use experience overall that also offers plenty of customization from a software perspective. So you can check out more details if you're interested in some of the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That was another rather bittersweet revisited look back at another LG device, the G7 here in 2025.